We're going to be speaking about Chanuka. So in order to speak about Chanuka, we have to talk about several different things. We have to talk about the actual narrative, the story about what happened and what we learned from that. We have to talk about light, and we have to talk about praise. So we'll speak about each one of these things separately. So first, let's talk about the actual events. Oftentimes when people talk about the word exile, to them it means expulsion from one's native land, being forced to live elsewhere. And it can. However, the entire Chanuka story took place in Eretz Yisrael. So not just the Chanuka story, but what we call Galut Yavan, the Grecian exile. We were never exiled to Greece. It took place in Eretz Yisrael, so that tells us that there's a whole other kind of exile. What kind of exile is that? It's what we'll call Galus Hada'at, where we're estranged from our own ability to draw conclusions, where the conclusions we draw are not our own but other people's. So Galut Hadat means, in the worst possible sense, spiritual exile. So with physical exile, physical movement gets you back to your land. But with spiritual exile, the only thing that gets you back to yourself is changing the way you think, which is much, much more complex. So let's talk about Galus Yavan. How did we end up in this situation? How did we end up in Galus, in our own land? So, the way things were, this is, it's like a blip in history. Here we are, the Grecian Empire is divided into sections. So to the south we have the Greek but Egyptian Empire. To the north we have the Greek but Syrian Empire. And we're somewhere in the middle of it. We're not the East, we're not Byzantine, we're not the West. Who are we? So the circumstances of our lives forced us into asking questions about our identity. So in general, when things are bad, we have no big identity issues. So as far as I know, again I may be mistaken, I don't know everyone in the world, but from the people I know who were Taimani, there was very little physical assimilation there other than the forced kind where the government there would take orphan children and force them into conversion to Islam. But you don't hear much about somebody like, reading the Quran and saying, this sounds right, and converting to Islam. Why not? So the reason is that their own lives were satisfactory, in a spiritual sense, certainly not physically, and what the surrounding society had spiritually was so unattractive that there was no reason to go there. The same thing held true to a very large degree for Jews in Europe, where when you study the bloody history of Jews in Europe, you come into a lot of surprises. People who were very ordinary people, who could have easily saved themselves by a momentary gesture, bow to the cross just once, and then it's finished. They died rather than do that. And again, it's because their own inner lives were satisfactory, which is a term that we have to discuss, and the outside had nothing to say to them. But when one's inner life isn't satisfactory, and the outer world has a lot to say, it's not so simple. So, what was going on the inside? So on the inside, during that entire period of time, what you find is that the relationship that people had to Klal Yisrael and their own identity within Klal Yisrael was lacking. This is true throughout the entire Second Temple period. So there was a lot of Torah, there was a lot of everything, but there was sinas chinam, which means that we weren't comfortable with our collective identity. We didn't look at him and see me. So individually we were doing well, but collectively we weren't doing so well. Okay, another thing that has to be said, it says, Chazal say, Lo barchu b'Torah, But Torah Techila, when people would learn, they didn't bless Hashem for giving the Torah. So they saw the Torah almost also as part of what I would call Olam HaPirud, the world of separation. It wasn't as directly connected to Hashem in their minds as it should have been. So we have separation from each other and separation from Hashem. We were living in the world of Pirud. As to a very large degree, we still are now. We still are now when we look at ourselves. And we have brilliant exceptions, brilliant, beautiful exceptions. But we're still very much in gullus in that regard. Now, what happened additionally is that Greek think began to enter our society through our exposure to what they think. So, what's the Greek